I had exactly one rule the night I crashed the most dangerous party in the Northern Territories. Get in, get the signature, and get out before anyone realized the name on my invitation belonged to a woman who had been dead for 6 years. Simple, clean, surgical. What I did not account for was Alistair Voss having a backbone for the first time in his miserable life, or the fact that the Lycan King would be standing in the one corridor I needed to escape through, looking at me like I was the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life. So now I am standing in a billionaire's hallway in a stolen dress, holding an unsigned document, and the most powerful man on the continent just scent-locked on me through a mask. Fantastic. Really fantastic. Chapter 1. The Stolen Name. The invitation was a dead woman's. And the dress was a liar's. And if either of those facts bothered me, I had stopped feeling it somewhere around the third month of planning. Name? The attendant at the gate was roughly the size of a refrigerator that had been taught posture. Margot Thorne, I said. House of Sable lineage, Western Registry, Tier 4. He swiped something on his tablet. His brow creased. Sable lineage hasn't sent a representative in 8 years, which is precisely why they sent me. The family prefers to rotate attendants. Prevents overfamiliarity. I had rehearsed that line 46 times. I kept a tally. The trick was not to sound confident. Confident people invited scrutiny. The trick was to sound bored. Bored people belonged. He stepped aside. Inside, the Sovereign Gala hit me like a sensory ambush. Vaulted ceilings, each crystal chandeliers throwing fractured light across marble so polished I could see my own reflection looking back at me with an expression that clearly said, "What are you doing here?" Good question. Best not to think about it. I found Alistair Voss in a corridor off the East Ballroom. Alone. Mid-50s, silver-haired, nursing whiskey with the face of a man who attended because refusing would have been noticed. Mr. Voss. He turned. Assessed me. Categorized me as minor bloodline he could not place. I don't believe we've met, he said. We haven't. But you knew my father. Graham Whitmore. The name landed like a stone in still water. I watched the ripples. Surprise, recognition, calculation, then the one I wanted. Fear. Ms. Whitmore, this is not the venue for 23 formal requests, 11 phone calls, 4 certified letters, 2 returned unopened. You will have to forgive me for improvising. I produced the document. Voluntary release of lien. 1 signature. 30 seconds of his time. Sign this, and the file I have compiled on the original brokerage deal stays in a locked drawer. Gathering dust. His pen touched the page, and then a door opened at the far end of the corridor. The footsteps were unhurried, the rhythm of someone who had never needed to rush because the world adjusted its pace to match theirs. Voss straightened instantly, deference pouring off him like heat. Your sovereign, Voss murmured. My stomach dropped. I turned. The Lycan King was standing 12 feet away. He was tall in a way that reorganized the architecture around him. Dark suit, matte black mask, and a stillness that had nothing to do with courtesy. The stillness of something at the top of the food chain, deciding whether the thing it just noticed was worth pursuing. He was looking at me. Our eyes met through the masks, and something shifted behind my ribs like a lock engaging, a tumbler falling into a groove that had been waiting for exactly that shape. My pulse doubled. My hands went numb. I could smell him from 12 feet away, which should have been impossible for a human nose. Cedar. Iron. Something warm and animal underneath that had no name. 3 seconds of eye contact, and my body decided, without consulting me, that this man was important in a way that superseded every decision I had ever made. I hated it immediately. The king took 1 step forward. My body responded with a wave of warmth so thorough I nearly gasped. I grabbed the unsigned document from Voss's hand and ran. Service corridor. Left turn. Through the kitchen staging area, past a startled server, through the utility passage, out the side door. Into the night air. Into the waiting car. Drive. The estate shrank in the rear window. I pressed my hand to my sternum where the feeling had started. 1 kilometer. 5. Across the territory border into the human district. The warmth did not fade. The document was unsigned. 29 days until the property seizure. And somewhere in a candlelit corridor, the Lycan King was breathing in the last trace of a scent that belonged to a woman who did not exist. I closed my eyes against the cold window and made myself a promise. I was going to ignore it. The warmth, the pull, all of it. The same way I ignored every inconvenient thing my body tried to tell me, with discipline, with stubbornness. And with the absolute conviction that Briar Whitmore did not lose control. The car turned onto the expressway, and the warmth behind my ribs kept pulsing, patient and sure, like it had all the time in the world. Chapter 2. The Gala Floor. 3 weeks after the gala, I discovered that my body was staging a quiet mutiny against everything I had ever believed about self-control. It started with the sleep, or rather, the absence of it. I would lie in bed at 2 in the morning, staring at a ceiling I had memorized down to the hairline crack above the light fixture, and my arm would drift across the mattress toward the empty side of the bed like it was searching for something. I would catch it mid-reach, pull it back, tuck it under the pillow, and 10 minutes later, it would do it again. My own limb, acting on instructions I had not issued. Then the smell. I was standing in line at a coffee shop 4 days after the gala when I realized I could separate every scent in the room. Not vaguely, precisely. The barista's detergent, lemon-based, probably store brand. The man ahead of me, leather jacket, nicotine residue on his left hand, anxiety sweat underneath his cologne that told me he was late for something he did not want to attend. A woman by the window, cocoa butter lotion, recently applied, and underneath it the iron tang of a paper cut she probably did not know she had. I had never been able to do that before. And underneath all of it, layered beneath my own scent like a watermark someone had pressed into my skin, I kept catching traces of him. Cedar. Iron. That warm animal undercurrent that I still could not name and could not scrub off no matter how many showers I took. He was not here. I knew he was not here, but my nervous system had apparently not received that memo and was operating on its own editorial calendar. I did what any rational woman would do. I researched. The underground archive network that served humans living adjacent to Lycan territories had exactly 3 academic texts on scentlock biology. I read all of them in one night, sitting cross-legged on my kitchen floor surrounded by my father's ledgers and a mug of tea that went cold in my hands because I forgot I was holding it. The findings were not comforting. Scentlock was bilateral. If he had imprinted on me, I had imprinted on him. The bond was neurochemical, not mystical, a permanent biological marker encoded at the receptor level that could not be trained away, medicated away, or reasoned away. In lichens, the symptoms of an unfulfilled bond were manageable: heightened awareness, mild sensory seeking, a persistent low-grade pull toward the bonded individual. Uncomfortable but functional. In humans, the symptoms were worse, significantly worse. The texts used phrases like sensory destabilization and involuntary proximity-seeking behavior and progressive disruption of baseline cognitive function, which were clinical ways of saying that my brain was slowly rewriting its own priorities without my permission, and the new priority list had exactly 1 item on it, and that item was a man I had looked at for 3 seconds in a hallway. I closed the last text at 4 in the morning, sat in the silence of my kitchen, and made a decision. I was not going to look for him. I was not going to acknowledge the pull. I had survived my father's death. His debts, the creditors, the humiliation of learning that my entire childhood had been financed by fraud. I had held my life together with duct tape and stubbornness for 3 years, and I was not about to hand my nervous system the keys because it had developed an opinion about a man in a mask. The property was still 26 days from seizure. Voss had not signed. I needed a new approach, and I needed it before the end of the month. And that required focus, and focus required sleep. And sleep required my body to stop reaching across the bed at 2 in the morning for someone who was not there. I could do this. I had done harder things. I stood up, dumped the cold tea, stacked the texts neatly on the counter, and walked to the window to close the curtain. That was when I saw the car. Black, tinted windows. Parked across the street in a space that had been empty for 3 weeks. Not idling, just sitting there, still as a held breath, positioned at an angle that gave its occupant a clean sightline to my building's entrance. I stepped back from the window. My pulse did something complicated. On the passenger seat, visible through a hairline gap in the window tint, was a file folder. Cream-colored, professional. And printed on the tab, in clean block letters, was a name I recognized. Margot Thorne. Someone was looking for the woman who crashed the Sovereign Gala, and they were parked outside my apartment. Chapter 3. The King Without a Cent. The car did not move for 6 hours. I know because I watched it. I pulled a chair to the window, angled it so I was invisible from the street, and I sat there with my father's binoculars, near which were the one possession of his that had not been sold, repossessed, or surrendered to creditors. They were military grade, completely unnecessary for a man who claimed to be in supply chain logistics. Another lie in a long catalog of lies, but at least this one was currently useful. The car was a late-model sedan, black, no plates visible from my angle. At 3 a.m., the interior light came on briefly, long enough for me to see a hand reach for the file folder and flip it open. The hand was male, large. The sleeve of the jacket was dark, well-tailored, and entirely unhelpful for identification purposes. At 5 a.m., the car started and pulled away without turning on its headlights for the first 2 blocks. Lycan. Only Lycans drove in darkness without lights. Their eyesight did not require them. I sat in the chair for another 20 minutes after the car was gone, binoculars in my lap, running scenarios. Someone had connected Margot Thorne's invitation to the woman who used it. Someone had obtained my address. And someone was now conducting surveillance with the patient, professional stillness of a person who did this kind of work routinely. 3 possibilities. 1. Voss had talked. Unlikely. The conversation in the corridor incriminated him more than it incriminated me, and Voss was the kind of man who protected himself first, second, and always. 2. The gala's security apparatus had identified the breach and was running an internal investigation. Possible, but Lycan internal security did not use unmarked civilian vehicles. They used uniformed escorts and formal summons. They were bureaucratic about their intimidation. Pi 3. Someone else entirely. Someone who had heard that the Lycan King scent locked at the gala and that the woman had vanished, and who had decided that information had strategic value. I did not like option 3. I also did not have time for it. 25 days until the property seizure. The document was still unsigned. And now I had a surveillance problem on top of a financial problem, on top of a biological problem that manifested as an inability to sleep, an involuntary improvement in my sense of smell, and a persistent warmth behind my ribs that had not dimmed by a single degree in 3 weeks. I needed to reach Voss again. Different approach this time. No masks, no galas, no stolen identities. I needed a legitimate channel, something he could not refuse without drawing attention. I spent the morning building one. My father's ledgers, the ones I had spent 3 years reconstructing, contained the financial DNA of every deal he had ever brokered. Most of them were ordinary: supply contracts, import licenses, distribution agreements, but 14 of them, buried across 6 different account books and coded in a shorthand my father had invented, involved Lycan financial entities operating through human shell companies. 13 of those entities had been dissolved. The 14th was still active, and its registered fiduciary agent, listed on public record in a filing from 7 years ago that no one had ever bothered to update, was Alistair Voss. A formal financial review request filed through the Human Commercial Registry would not compel Voss to meet with me, but it would compel the fiduciary office to acknowledge the filing, so which would generate a response letter, which would create a documented paper trail that made ignoring me significantly more expensive than meeting with me. Bureaucracy as leverage. My father would have been impressed. Or horrified. The line between those two reactions had always been thin with him. I filed the request at noon. I expected a response within 10 business days. I got one in 4 hours. Not from the fiduciary office, not from Voss. From a private number, received as a single text message on the phone I used exclusively for estate-related business. No greeting, no signature, just an address and a time. And underneath, 6 words that turned my blood to sleet. He knows what you smell like. Chapter 4. What the body remembers. I did not go to the address. I want to be clear about that. Because the version of this story where I receive an anonymous text from an unknown number and immediately drive to a mystery location is the version where I end up on a true crime podcast, and my survival instincts, which had kept me alive through situations significantly worse than this, were not interested in that narrative arc. Instead, I did 3 things. I changed the SIM card in my estate phone. I moved the most critical of my father's ledgers from the apartment to a rented storage locker across town. And I started varying my daily routes with the randomized paranoia of a woman who had watched too many spy thrillers, but was discovering, with some irritation, that the spy thrillers had been right about most of it. The black car reappeared twice in the following week. Once outside the storage facility, and which meant they had followed me, and once in the parking lot of the grocery store I used on Wednesdays, which meant they knew my patterns. I was being profiled, methodically, quietly, by someone with resources and patience. Meanwhile, my body continued its campaign of insubordination. The scent traces were getting stronger. I woke up on Thursday morning and the pillow smelled like cedar so intensely that I sat up in bed and checked the room for an intruder. There was no one there. Of course there was no one there. But my olfactory system had decided to generate the scent unprompted, a biological hallucination manufactured by a bond that was not being fulfilled, and the texts I had read warned about this exact progression. Phantom scent escalation, the driest of the 3 texts had called it. The bonded human's neurochemistry will attempt to compensate for physical absence by generating increasingly vivid sensory approximations of the bonded Lycan's scent profile. This is involuntary and will intensify over time. Wonderful. My brain was manufacturing the smell of a man I had met for 3 seconds because it had decided, unilaterally, that 3 seconds was sufficient data to restructure my entire sensory reality. I started drinking more coffee. Not because it helped, but because it gave my hands something to do at 4 in the morning when the reaching started, and the phantom cedar crawled across my pillow, and the warmth behind my ribs pulsed like it was trying to communicate in a language I refused to learn. The financial review filing produced results on day 6, not the response I expected. Then the fiduciary office did not send a letter. They sent a notice of compliance review to Voss's primary financial entity, which meant the filing had triggered an automated regulatory flag, which meant Voss was now dealing with paperwork he had not anticipated, which meant I had his attention. He confirmed this by calling me directly. "You filed a review request," he said, and his voice carried the precise temperature of a man who had been interrupted during something important by a problem he thought he had already solved. "You left the gala without signing my document." I was interrupted. "By the Sovereign." "Yes, I was there." A pause. The kind that carried calculation. "Ms. Whitmore, the situation has become more complicated since our conversation." "How so?" Another pause. Longer. "There are parties interested in your identity. Parties with resources I would prefer not to describe over an unsecured line. The name Margot Thorne has attracted attention beyond what either of us intended, and I strongly suggest you consider the possibility that your current approach to this matter is putting you in a position you are not equipped to navigate." "Is that concern, Mr. Voss? It sounds almost paternal." "It is self-preservation. If your identity becomes public, the trail leads back to me, and I have no interest in explaining to a bloodline tribunal why I was conducting private financial business with a human infiltrator at the Sovereign Gala." "Then sign the document. Make me disappear." Silence. "I will send a courier," he said finally. 48 hours. Have the document ready." He hung up before I could respond. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, and for exactly 4 seconds I allowed myself to feel something dangerously close to hope. 48 hours. A courier. A signature. The property saved. The debt chain broken. The beginning of the end of everything my father had left me to clean up. Then I looked out the window. The black car was back. Same spot. Same angle. Same clean sightline to my entrance. But this time, parked directly behind it, was a second vehicle. Silver. Different make. Different tint grade. And on the dashboard, visible through the windshield in the afternoon light, was a small object I recognized from photographs in the academic texts I had been reading. A scent amplifier. Lycan grade field equipment used by territorial trackers to isolate and follow biological signatures across long distances. 2 cars, 2 separate parties. One was watching me, and the other was hunting me. Chapter 5. The Tracker's Radius. Voss's courier never arrived. 48 hours came and went like a bus I had been sprinting toward, only to watch it pull away from the curb without slowing down. I called Voss's number. Disconnected. I called his office. The assistant who used to hang up on me now let it ring to voicemail, which was somehow worse, because even the rejection had been downgraded from active to passive. Something had changed. Between the phone call and the 48-hour window, something had pressured Voss into silence, and silence from a man like Alistair Voss was never voluntary. It was purchased. 20 days until the property seizure. I was running out of angles, and the angles I had left were getting sharper. The surveillance situation had evolved as well. The black car continued its rotation, appearing at irregular intervals near my apartment, my storage facility, and a cafe I had visited exactly once, which meant they were not just tracking my patterns. They were tracking my deviations from my patterns. Professional, thorough, expensive. The silver car with the scent amplifier had disappeared after that single appearance, which frightened me more than its presence had. The first car wanted to watch me. The second car wanted to find something specific, and either it had found it or it had moved to a phase of operation that no longer required proximity. I was sitting at my kitchen table on the 19th day, staring at the unsigned document and calculating how many assets I had left to liquidate, when someone knocked on my door. Not the building's front entrance. My apartment door. 4th floor. No buzzer notification, no intercom call. Whoever was on the other side of that door had entered my building without using the main entrance. I picked up the heaviest object within reach, which was a cast-iron bookend shaped like a horse that had belonged to my father, and approached the door with the measured steps of a woman who had answered unexpected knocks before and had learned that the person on the other side was never delivering good news. I looked through the peephole. Every rational thought I had emptied from my head like water from an overturned glass. He was taller than I remembered. That was the first thing that registered. The absurd, unhelpful observation that the Lycan King was taller without the visual context of a grand corridor to scale him against. He was wearing dark clothing, no suit this time, something simpler, and no mask. The absence of the mask was almost violent. It revealed a face that was angular, strong-jawed, and arranged in an expression I could not immediately categorize. Not anger, not demand. Something quieter than both. He looked like a man who had been searching for something for a very long time and was now standing in front of the door it was behind, and the only thing left to do was knock. I realized I was still holding the horse book end. I set it down. I took a breath that did not help. I opened the door. The scent hit us at the same time. I know it was simultaneous because I watched it happen to him as it happened to me. A visible, full-body response, pupils dilating, shoulders rolling back, breath catching in the chest. 3 weeks of separation had pressurized the bond into something dense and volatile. And opening that door was like unsealing a chamber. Cedar, iron, that unnamed warmth. It rolled over me in a wave so thorough that my hand tightened on the doorframe to keep my knees honest. His jaw tightened. His eyes, which were dark and steady and looking at me with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but was not, dropped to my hand on the doorframe and stayed there for a moment, reading the white-knuckled grip the way a doctor reads a symptom. Neither of us spoke for 5 full seconds. "You run fast," he said. His voice was lower than I expected, calm, a little dry. "You knock loud," I replied, which was not my finest work, but my brain was operating at approximately 30% capacity because the remaining 70% was busy cataloging the precise way his scent layered against the stale apartment air. "May I come in?" "That depends. Did you bring the 2 cars that have been parked outside my building for the past 3 weeks? Or is that someone else's project?" Something shifted in his expression. "The black car is not mine." "And the silver one? With the scent amplifier?" A pause. "That one is mine. Was mine. I recalled it 8 days ago. After it found what it was looking for. After it confirmed what I already knew." He held my gaze. "You are not Margot Thorne." "Margot Thorne has been dead for 6 years. I would hope that was obvious." "It was. Your scent is human. That was less obvious and significantly more interesting." We stood there in my doorway, the most powerful lichen on the continent, and a woman in an oversized sweater, holding an invisible line that they both knew was already dissolving. And the sheer absurdity of the situation almost made me laugh. Almost. "My name is Briar Whitmore," I said, because there was no point left in hiding it. "I am human. I crashed your gala using a dead woman's invitation to get a financial document signed. I am in debt, under surveillance by someone who is not you, and 19 days away from losing the last property attached to my family's name." I took a breath. "And if you are here because of what happened in that corridor, I need you to know that I did not plan it. I do not understand it, and I have been actively trying to ignore it for 3 weeks." He studied me for a long moment. Then his mouth did something that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. "How is that working for you?" "Terribly. For me as well?" He did not come in that night. I did not invite him. And we stood in my doorway for 40 minutes and had the most honest conversation I had shared with another human being, or non-human being, in 3 years. And by the end of it, nothing was resolved. But something had shifted. He told me about Voss, about why the courier never came, about the bloodline families circling his refusal to mate strategically, and the specific family, the Haverels, who had the most to gain from discrediting any alternative. And then he told me the thing that made my blood go cold. Voss received an offer, Rhett said, for your identity, your real name, your address, and the fact that the woman the king sent locked on at the Sovereign Gala is human. Who made the offer? I do not know yet, but Voss is a man who sells things, Ms. Whitmore, and someone has already paid. He left after that. I closed the door, pressed my back against it, and slid to the floor. The warmth behind my ribs was not pulsing anymore. It was roaring. Chapter 6. The Knock. Over the next 11 days, Rhett Ashford and I built something that I did not have a word for and refused to name. It started with logistics. He had information I needed: the identity of the buyer, the political landscape shifting around the Gala breach, the timeline of the Haverels maneuvering. I had information he needed: the financial documentation connecting Voss to the brokerage deals, the scope of my father's entanglement with Lycan commerce, and a ground-level perspective on how Lycan financial entities exploited humans that his advisors had never provided because it was not in their interest to. So we met. Not at his estate, which was a political fishbowl. Not at my apartment, which was under surveillance. On neutral ground, in the spaces between our respective worlds where the power imbalance flattened to something manageable. A late-night diner at the edge of the Lycan border, where the waitress refilled coffee without looking up, and the fluorescent lights made everyone look equally terrible. A bookshop in the human district that stayed open past midnight and smelled like old paper and quiet. A bench overlooking the river that separated the territories, where the water was dark and the city noise softened to a hum. I told myself these meetings were strategic. Information exchanges, tactical collaboration between two people with a shared problem. I was lying, and I knew I was lying. And I kept lying because the alternative was admitting that I sat on that bench for 3 hours, not because of the intelligence he provided, but because of the way he listened. Rhett Ashford listened with his entire body. When I talked, he angled toward me like a compass finding north. And when something I said landed in a place that mattered, he would close his eyes for half a second before responding, as if he needed a moment to put the words somewhere safe before he could answer them. Nobody had ever listened to me like that. Not my father, not the lawyers, not the creditors who sat in my kitchen and let the silence do their work. Rhett did not use silence as a weapon. He used it as a room, and he let me fill it at whatever pace I chose. I told him about my father, not the financial details which he already had, the personal ones. In what it felt like to sort through a dead man's desk and discover that the life he had described to you over breakfast for 22 years was a construction. That the house you grew up in was purchased with money that did not exist. That the man who taught you to ride a bicycle and check the oil in a car and negotiate a contract had been, underneath all of it, someone you had never actually met. Rhett did not comfort me. He did not offer platitudes or perspective. He sat beside me on the bench, close enough that the scent bond hummed between us like a low electrical current, and he said, "That must have been disorienting." Disorienting. Not tragic, not terrible, not any of the dramatic words people reached for when they wanted to perform empathy. Disorienting, precise, accurate. If the word of a man who understood that sometimes the worst thing about pain was not the pain itself, but the way it rearranged your sense of direction. I almost touched him that night. My hand moved 6 inches across the bench before I caught it, pulled it back, and pretended I was adjusting my sleeve. He saw. He did not mention it, but his breathing changed, and I filed that information in a part of my brain that was rapidly becoming a dedicated archive of things Rhett Ashford did when he was trying not to react. On the 8th day, he told me about his father, the sudden death, the sovereign seat inherited before he was ready. The bloodline families descending like creditors of a different kind, each one holding an invoice for loyalty that came with terms he had never agreed to. He told me about the specific loneliness of being surrounded by people who needed things from you, and knowing that not a single one of them would stay if the title disappeared. We have that in common, I said. Which part? The part where everyone wants something and the something is never actually you. He looked at me. The river moved behind us. The city hummed. Until now, he said. I did not respond. I could not respond because my chest was doing that thing again, the lock and tumbler sensation. Except this time, it was not a single click. It was a slow, continuous turning, like a door opening in increments so small I could pretend it was not happening. On the 11th night, we were at the diner. Late. The waitress had stopped refilling the coffee and started giving us the look that meant she wanted to go home. Rhett was explaining the political structure of the Bloodline Council when I noticed his hands. They were trembling. Not from cold. The diner was warm. Almost too warm. Not from anger. His voice was steady, his posture composed. His hands were shaking because he was sitting 18 inches from me and had been for 2 hours. And the sustained effort of being that close without touching me was costing him something physical. I stared at his hands. He saw me notice. The trembling stopped, controlled by sheer will, but the effort of stopping it tightened his jaw in a way that made something inside my chest crack open like a window someone had painted shut. Neither of us acknowledged it. We paid the check. We walked to the door. And in the parking lot, under lights that buzzed with the particular frequency of places that exist between midnight and nowhere, Rhett stopped walking. Briar. First time he had used my first name. I turned. The Haverells are presenting a formal accusation to the Bloodline Council tomorrow. Criminal trespass, identity fraud, intent to manipulate the Sovereign's biological judgment through artificial means. The ground shifted under me. Artificial means. They are claiming I manufactured the scent lock. They know it cannot be manufactured. The accusation does not need to be true. It needs to be useful. What happens if the council convenes a tribunal? You will be summoned. If you do not appear, you are tried in absence. The penalty for trespass is permanent territorial exile, which means I cannot protect you inside Lycan borders. And whoever purchased your identity from Voss will have unrestricted access to a woman with no legal standing in either world. I stood in that parking lot and felt, very precisely, the walls of every option I had left closing inward. How long do I have? 9 days. 9 days. I had 19 days before the property seizure, 9 before the tribunal, and exactly 0 allies inside a system that was designed, from its foundation, to crush people who look like me. Rhett watched my face, and I watched him stop himself from offering to fix it. I could see the effort, the restraint. He knew, because he had spent 11 days learning the shape of my pride, that offering to intervene would insult me more than the accusation itself. I will be at the tribunal, he said, but I cannot speak on your behalf. If I do, I confirm their narrative. That I control you. That you influence me. The distinction matters to them. It should not, but it does. I nodded. The cold air pressed against my face, and for one unguarded moment I let myself feel the full weight of what was coming. A tribunal designed to destroy me, built on a lie, administered by people who had decided I was a threat before they knew my name. Then I straightened my shoulders, because that was what I did. That was what I always did. 9 days, I said. I have worked with less. I turned and walked to my car and drove home and climbed 4 flights of stairs and unlocked my apartment door and walked to the closet where I kept my father's ledgers. I pulled every single one of them out. 12 binders. 3 years of reconstructed records. Every contract. Every payment. Every forged document. Every lie my father had told and every truth he had hidden, organized chronologically and cross-referenced by entity. The Haverels wanted a tribunal. Fine. I was going to give them one they would never forget. Chapter 7. Neutral Ground. 9 days is not a lot of time to build a legal defense against an institution that does not recognize you as a person. I say that not for sympathy, but for context, because the way I spent those 9 days probably looked unhinged from the outside, and I need you to understand that it was, in fact, extremely calculated unhingedness. Day 1. I laid every ledger out on my apartment floor in chronological order and walked the timeline of my father's financial entanglement with Lycan Commerce from beginning to end. Not the version I had been telling myself for 3 years, Isha, the one where he was a naive man exploited by smarter predators. The real version. The one where he was complicit in his own destruction, where he had signed contracts he understood, taken money he knew was structured to fail, and built a life for his daughter on a foundation he knew would eventually collapse. It hurt. It always hurt. But pain was not the point. The point was the paper trail, and the paper trail was immaculate, because whatever else my father had been, he had been meticulous. Every deal was documented. Every transaction was receipted. Every forged contract had a corresponding original that showed the alteration. Day 2. I cross-referenced every Lycan entity in my father's records against the public financial registry. 14 entities, 13 dissolved. The 14th, Voss's, still active. But the dissolved entities were not gone. They had been restructured, renamed, absorbed into larger financial architectures that traced back, through 6 layers of corporate insulation, to 4 bloodline families. One of those families was the Haverels. I sat on my kitchen floor at 2 in the morning with that discovery vibrating in my hands like a live wire. The family accusing me of infiltrating the gala for personal gain had been profiting from the financial system that destroyed my father for over a decade. They were not prosecuting a trespasser. They were protecting an investment. Day 3 through 7. I built the case. Not a legal defense in the traditional sense, because Lycan tribunals did not operate on human legal frameworks. They operated on narrative. Whoever told the more compelling story won. Mian and the Haverels had been writing their story for weeks. A calculating human woman who used a stolen identity to infiltrate the Sovereign Gala and compromise the king's biological judgment. My story was simpler, and it had receipts. I organized the documentation into 3 sections. Section 1, the original brokerage deals, showing the systematic exploitation of human businesses by Lycan financial entities. Section 2, the restructuring trail, showing how the profits from those deals flowed into bloodline family accounts, including the Haverels. Section 3, my 3-year effort to resolve the matter through legitimate channels, 23 requests, 11 calls, 4 letters, every single one documented and time-stamped. The narrative was not, "I am innocent." The narrative was, "I am the consequence of a system you built, and if you put me on trial, I will show everyone in the room exactly how that system works." Day 8. Rhett sent word through Calloway, his chief of intelligence, a man I had not met but whose handwriting I was becoming familiar with. The tribunal was confirmed. Formal session, full bloodline council attendance. The Haverels had requested public gallery access, which meant they wanted an audience for the destruction. I read Calloway's note twice, folded it, and put it in the pocket of my jacket. Day 9. I did not sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with the organized documentation stacked in 3 neat piles, and I rehearsed. Not the words, because the words would come when I needed them. The composure. The steadiness of voice that would not crack when I talked about my father. The posture that would not bend when a room full of Lycans looked at me and saw something less than themselves. I practiced being unbreakable. At 6 in the morning, I showered, dressed in the most structured, severe outfit I owned, a black blazer and trousers that made me look like a woman who audited things for a living, and packed the documentation into a leather case my father had used for client presentations. There was a car waiting downstairs. Not the black surveillance car. Not Rhett's silver tracker. A town car, plain, unmarked, sent by Calloway with a note that said simply, "The Sovereign sends no escort. He sends transport." The distinction is intentional. I understood. Rhett was not protecting me. He was making sure I could get there. What I did when I arrived was my own problem. I got in the car. The driver pulled onto the expressway toward the Northern Territory, and in my chest, the warmth that had been pulsing for 32 days went quiet for the first time. Not gone, not faded, still, like it was holding its breath. Chapter 8. The Haverhill Play. The tribunal hall was designed to make humans feel small, and I say that with the clinical appreciation of a woman who recognized architectural intimidation when she saw it. Vaulted stone ceiling, no windows, torchlight, actual torchlight. Because apparently the Bloodline Council believed that aesthetic commitment to the medieval period was a substitute for a functioning legal system. The chamber was circular, with tiered seating rising on 3 sides and a single open floor at the center where the accused was meant to stand. No chair, no table, no podium. Just a stone floor and a circle of elevated faces looking down. I walked to the center of that floor with my leather case in one hand and my composure in the other, and I planted my feet like I was putting down roots. The gallery was full. I could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, the curiosity, the hostility, the predatory interest of people watching something they had been told was dangerous and wanting to see for themselves. The Haverhills were seated in the accusers section, a raised platform to my left. Lord Edric Haverhill, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, sat with the practiced stillness of a man who believed the outcome was already determined. His daughter Genevieve sat beside him, mid-20s, beautiful in the polished, deliberate way of someone who had been groomed for a specific purpose since birth. She looked at me with an expression I recognized instantly because I had seen it on every creditor who had ever sat in my kitchen. Certainty. She was certain this was already over. I found Rhett without looking for him. The sovereign chair was elevated above the council tier, centered at the back of the chamber, and he sat in it with the absolute stillness I had come to understand was not calm, but control. His face revealed nothing. His eyes revealed everything, but only to me, and only because I had spent 11 nights learning the grammar of his restraint. He did not nod. He did not acknowledge me. That was the agreement. That was the cost. The chief elder, a woman named Draven with a voice like gravel wrapped in authority, opened proceedings. The accusation was read. Criminal trespass under stolen identity, seen with intent to manipulate the sovereign's biological judgment through artificial means. The Haverhill's advocate presented the case. He was polished, precise, and effective. The stolen invitation, the dead woman's name, the unauthorized entry, the corridor where the king's scent lock was triggered. He laid it out like a blueprint, each fact clicking into place with the mechanical elegance of a trap being assembled in real time. The gallery murmured. I stood in the center of the floor and let the narrative wash over me without reacting, because reacting was what they wanted. Outrage would confirm aggression. Tears would confirm weakness. Silence, steady and measured, confirmed nothing, and confirmation of nothing was the only ground I could hold until it was my turn to speak. The advocate finished. Elder Draven turned to me. The accused may respond. I opened the leather case. I will not begin with the gala, I said. I will begin with why the gala was necessary. The room shifted. I felt it, a collective recalibration, as if every person in the chamber had expected me to start with a denial, and I had opened a door they did not know existed. I laid the documentation on the stone floor in front of me because there was no table, and I refused to let the absence of furniture become a disadvantage. My name is Briar Whitmore. My father was Graham Whitmore, a human businessman who brokered supply contracts between human manufacturers and Lycan-controlled territories for 19 years. When he died, he left debts, significant debts, structured debts, designed into the contracts from their inception, that guaranteed default and asset transfer. I named Voss. I named the entities. I produced the original contracts alongside the altered versions and let the elders see the differences for themselves. Then I produced Section 2. The dissolved entities that profited from these deals were restructured into 4 financial architectures. One of those architectures traces directly to the Haverhill family's territorial investment fund. The silence in the chamber was a living thing. Edric Haverhill did not move, but his daughter's certainty flickered just once, like a candle in a draught. I entered the gala to obtain a signature from Alistair Voss that would release the final lien on my family's property. I used a stolen identity because every legitimate channel available to a human petitioning a Lycan financial entity had been exhausted. I did not enter that building to find a mate. I did not enter to manipulate anyone. I entered to survive. I paused. And if this tribunal wishes to punish me for that, I understand. But I would ask the council to consider what it means that a human woman had to commit a crime to access a remedy that should have been available through your own system. The chamber was silent for 11 seconds. I counted. Elder Draven spoke first. The tribunal will deliberate. The accused will remain. I stayed on the stone floor with my documentation spread around me like a battlefield, and my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth. And from the sovereign chair, Rhett Ashford watched me with an expression that no one else in the room could read. But I could. It was pride. Chapter 9. The Tribunal. The deliberation took 47 minutes. I know, because I counted every one of them standing on that stone floor with my back straight and my hands clasped, and my knees doing something unforgivable behind the fabric of my trousers. 47 minutes of murmured consultation at the elder tier, while the gallery watched me, the way audiences watch tightrope walkers, not rooting for the fall exactly, but not looking away either. The Haverhills sat in their section like people waiting for a table at a restaurant, patient, entitled, annoyed by the delay but not concerned about the outcome. Voss was in the back of the gallery. I had spotted him during my presentation, seated in the last row with the posture of a man who wanted to be close enough to hear, but far enough to deny attendance later. He had not looked at me once. He had stared at the documentation on the floor like it was a grenade with the pin already pulled. Elder Draven returned to the center podium. The tribunal has reached a determination. The chamber went silent. On the charge of criminal trespass, the evidence supports unauthorized entry under a false identity. The charge is sustained. My stomach dropped. The gallery exhaled. Edric Haverhill's posture did not change, because this was the outcome he had purchased. On the charge of intent to manipulate the sovereign's biological judgment through artificial means. Draven paused. She looked at me with eyes that gave nothing away, and I realized with a sharp, nauseating clarity that the next sentence was going to determine the trajectory of everything that followed. The charge is dismissed. Scentlock biology cannot be artificially induced. The council finds no evidence of manipulation, no evidence of premeditation toward the sovereign, and no evidence that the accused was aware of the king's presence in the corridor prior to the encounter. The gallery erupted. Not dramatically, Lycans did not shout in formal chambers, but the murmuring swelled to a volume that Elder Draven had to silence with a raised hand. Furthermore, she continued, and the word cut through the noise like a blade, The documentation presented by the accused raises substantive questions regarding financial practices within Lycan human brokerage systems. The tribunal recommends a formal investigation into the entities named in the accused's evidence, including any connections to bloodline family investment structures. I did not look at the Haverils. I did not need to. I could feel Edric Haverill's stillness change texture from confidence to stone. The accused is assessed a penalty of formal censure for the trespass, recorded but not enforced, contingent on no further violations. She is free to leave. Free to leave. 3 words. My vision blurred. I blinked it clear because I was not going to cry in this chamber, not in front of the Haverils, not in front of the gallery, not in front of Rhett, who had sat in that sovereign chair for 47 minutes without moving a single muscle, and whose restraint had cost him more than anyone in this room would ever understand. I gathered my documentation from the stone floor. My hands were steady. My hands were absolutely steady, and I was going to maintain that fiction until I was out of this building or dead, whichever came first. I walked out of the chamber, down the stone corridor, around the corner, out of sightline from the gallery doors, and then my knees gave out. I caught myself against the wall with one hand, the leather case clutched to my chest with the other, and I bent forward and breathed in ragged, graceless gulps that echoed off the stone in a way that made them sound worse than they were. The adrenaline crash hit like a wave. 3 years. 3 years of ledgers and letters and phone calls and humiliation and 4 a.m. mornings and white-knuckled survival. And it had all narrowed to a stone floor in a medieval chamber and a 60-second verdict. I heard footsteps behind me. I did not turn around. I did not need to. I knew the rhythm. Steady, unhurried. The footsteps of a man who had never needed to rush. He stopped 6 feet away. He did not touch me. He did not speak. He stood in that corridor, 6 feet of deliberate distance, and he waited. My breathing slowed. The shaking did not stop, but it softened to something manageable. I straightened against the wall. I still did not turn around. You did not speak, I said. My voice was raw. No. You sat in that chair and watched them accuse me of manipulating you, and you said nothing. Yes. Because if you defended me, you confirmed their narrative. Yes. I pressed my forehead against the cool stone. That must have been difficult. A pause. The kind that carried weight. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. Something cracked inside my chest. Not the bond, not the warmth. Something older than that. Something I had built 3 years ago when I decided that needing anyone was a luxury I could not afford. I did not collapse into him. I did not turn around and fall into his arms like a woman in a painting. I stood against that wall with my forehead on the stone and my case pressed to my chest, and I simply stopped holding him at a distance. Don't leave, I said. 2 words. The most terrifying 2 words I had ever spoken. I am not going anywhere, he said. And he did not move. He stayed exactly where he was, 6 feet away, close enough to reach but not reaching, and I stood there and shook and let someone witness it for the first time in 3 years. Chapter 10. The Still Point. Rhett brought me to the estate that evening. Not the formal halls, not the political chambers. A private wing on the western side of the manor that overlooked the lake, one with tall windows and a fireplace that someone had already lit, and the kind of quiet that did not feel empty but full, like the room had been waiting to be occupied. I sat on the sofa nearest the fire and realized I had not been warm in weeks. Not the phantom warmth of the bond, which burned and ached and demanded. Real warmth. The uncomplicated warmth of a fire and a solid roof and a room that no one was going to take away from me. When did you last eat? Rhett asked. I considered lying. Yesterday. Maybe the day before. He left the room without comment and returned 10 minutes later with bread, cheese, cold meat, and a glass of water. He set it on the table beside me and sat in the chair across the room. Not beside me. Across. Giving me the distance I had not yet told him I no longer needed. I ate because my body required it, not because I tasted anything. Then I set the plate aside and looked at him. "Ask me," I said. He tilted his head slightly. "Ask you what?" "Whatever you have been holding back for 32 days. The questions you did not ask at the diner or the bookshop or the bench because you were being patient and careful and respectful of my boundaries. Ask me now. I am tired of boundaries." Something shifted in his expression. A softening that was almost imperceptible, like ice thinning from beneath. "What does the bond feel like from your side?" There it was. The question underneath every other question. I looked at the fire. It feels like my body made a decision that my mind was not consulted on. Like I woke up one morning and discovered that my nervous system had signed a contract without reading the terms. I paused. The insomnia started the first week. The phantom scent the second. By the third week, I was waking up reaching for someone who was not there, and I hated it, because I have spent 3 years making sure I never reached for anyone. And now? Now I am sitting in your house, eating your food, and I told you not to leave me in a hallway 40 minutes ago, so I think we can both agree that my strategy of disciplined denial has been a comprehensive failure. His mouth twitched. Almost a smile. I was collecting those almost smiles like evidence. "From my side," he said, and his voice dropped to something quieter, more private. "It feels like recognition, not attraction, though that is there. Recognition. As if my biology has always known the precise scent signature of the person it was looking for, and when I walked into that corridor, every receptor I have said the same thing at the same time. What did they say? 'There you are.'" The fire cracked. I stared at him across the room and felt the walls I had built shift on their foundations. Not collapse. Shift. Rearrange. Make space. "I am not easy," I said. "I am proud and private, and I handle things alone, and I will never be the kind of woman who folds into someone else's life, like I was designed to fit there. I know. I will fight you on things that do not require fighting because I do not know how to stop defending a perimeter that no one is attacking. I know that too. And I cannot promise that I will not wake up tomorrow and try to rebuild every wall I just took down, because that is what I do. That is what I have always done." Rhett leaned forward in his chair. His hands were steady now. No trembling. The proximity was close enough, the bond settled enough, that the shaking had stopped. "Briar," he said, "I did not scent lock on a woman who was easy. I scent locked on a woman who broke into the most secure event in the Northern Territories, with a dead woman's name and a forged invitation, and made Alistair Voss sign a document while the Sovereign walked past. I am not interested in easy. I am interested in you." The warmth behind my ribs did something new. It did not pulse. It did not roar. It settled. Like a frequency finding its match. Like two tuning forks vibrating at the same pitch until the resonance was indistinguishable from silence. I stood up. I walked across the room. I stopped in front of his chair, and I pressed my palm flat against his chest over his heartbeat. He covered my hand with his. His pulse was strong, steady, being and perfectly synchronized with the warmth behind my ribs, as if the bond had been calibrating for 32 days and had finally, quietly, locked into alignment. We stayed like that, standing, breathing, his hand over mine, my palm over his heart. When the kiss came, it was not dramatic. It was not desperate. It was a slow closing of the last distance, foreheads touching first, breath shared, then the softest possible contact. A question and an answer at the same time. I pulled back half an inch. His eyes were closed. "There you are," I whispered. And he smiled. A real one. The first I had ever seen. Chapter 11. The Cost of Choosing. 3 days after the tribunal, the Haverels withdrew from the Bloodline Council's annual summit in a move that the political analysts in Rhett's circle described as strategic repositioning, and that with considerably less diplomatic vocabulary, described as running. They were not gone. Edric Haverel was too entrenched, too connected, too wealthy to simply disappear from the political landscape. But the tribunal had cost him something money could not repurchase: credibility. The financial investigation Draven had recommended was now formally underway, and the documentation I had provided, 3 years of reconstructed records from a dead man's filing cabinet, had become the evidentiary foundation. My father's ledgers were doing more damage from beyond the grave than he had ever managed while he was alive. I did not know whether that was justice or irony, but I suspected it was both. Meanwhile, the political fallout from Rhett's refusal to engage strategically was accelerating. I learned about it not from Rhett, who discussed politics with me the way he discussed everything, honestly but without urgency, but from Calloway, who had developed the habit of leaving typed briefings in the private wing with the clinical detachment of a man who believed that civilians should be informed but not alarmed. The briefings painted a clear picture. Rhett had formally rejected every pending mating proposal from the bloodline families. He had done this not in a dramatic public declaration, but through individual written notices, each one identical in language, each one absolute in its finality. The notices did not mention me. They did not need to. Everyone knew. 2 families, the Ashcrofts of the Eastern Ridge and the Pembrokes of the Southern Corridor, accepted the rejection with the resigned pragmatism of people who had always known it was a long shot. 2 others, the Driscolls and the Varenne line, requested formal audiences to discuss alternatives, which was diplomatic language for begging. The Haverels sent nothing. Their silence was louder than any response, and then the withdrawals started. The Driscoll family formally suspended their territorial trade agreement with the sovereign seat, citing structural concerns. The Varenne line followed within 48 hours. 2 of the smaller vassal pacts, who had always aligned with whichever major family was ascendant, quietly redirected their supply contracts to Haverel-affiliated distributors. Rhett was being isolated, methodically, financially, politically. The bloodline families could not remove him from the sovereign seat. His claim was biological and irrevocable, but they could starve the seat of the cooperative infrastructure that made it functional. I read Calloway's briefing on the withdrawals sitting at the window of the private wing, overlooking the lake, and I felt something cold settle into my stomach. This was the cost. Not of the bond, not of the tribunal. Of me. Of a human woman with no bloodline, no status, and no political utility existing in a space that had been reserved for someone who could strengthen the sovereign's position, not weaken it. I found Rhett in the East Study that evening. He was reading the same briefings I had read, though his copies had additional margins filled with Calloway's handwritten annotations. "The Driscolls suspended trade," I said. "Yes." The Varenne line followed. "Yes." 2 vassal pacts redirected supply contracts. 3. The Holloways joined this afternoon. I stood in the doorway and let the math settle. 3 vassal pacts, 2 major families, trade agreements paused, supply lines rerouted, political alliances fraying at the edges like rope under sustained tension. This is because of me. Rhett looked up from the briefing. His expression was even, unguarded in a way he only allowed when we were alone. This is because of a system that has operated unchallenged for centuries and is now being challenged. You are the catalyst, not the cause. That is a very elegant distinction for a man whose trade agreements are collapsing. The trade agreements were leveraged against me long before you arrived. The families have always used economic cooperation as a leash. What has changed is not the leash. It is that I have stopped pretending it is not there. I crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite his desk. And if the isolation deepens, if more families withdraw, if the sovereign seat becomes functionally powerless because the infrastructure refuses to cooperate, then I rebuild the infrastructure with partners who do not require me to auction my biology for their cooperation. He said it simply, the way he said everything that mattered, without drama, without emphasis, with the quiet certainty of a man who had calculated the cost before he made the choice and decided the choice was still worth making. I looked at him across that desk. This man who was dismantling his own political architecture because his nervous system had identified a human woman in a stolen dress as the person it was built to find. And I understood something that I had been circling for weeks without landing on. He was not choosing me over his kingdom. He was choosing to build a kingdom that did not require him to betray himself. And I was not the price of that project. I was the reason he finally started it. The council session is tomorrow, Rhett said. I intend to formally register the recognition in the sovereign record. Which makes it permanent. Which makes it true, it was already permanent. I sat in that chair and felt the weight of what he was about to do settle around me like a coat I had not asked for, but was not going to take off. I want to be there, I said. He studied me. The gallery will be hostile. The gallery has been hostile since I was born human. I have had practice. That almost smile, the one I had been collecting. Tomorrow. And then, he said. I left the study and walked to the private wing and stood at the window where I could see the lake turning silver in the last light. Tomorrow, Rhett Ashford was going to stand in front of the Bloodline Council and register his recognition of a human woman with a dead father's debts and a criminal censure on her record. And it was going to cost him alliances, revenue, and the political goodwill of families who had held power for generations. And I was going to sit in the gallery and watch him do it. Because if he was brave enough to choose, I was brave enough to witness what it cost. The warmth behind my ribs pulsed once. Steady. Sure. I pressed my hand to my chest and held it there and let it be enough. Chapter 12. One open hand. The council chamber was exactly as hostile as Rhett had promised. I sat in the upper gallery with my hands folded in my lap and my spine pressed against the stone seat, and I watched every single face in the room decide what I was before I had drawn a second breath. The Driscolls looked through me. The Varenne representatives studied me like a document they intended to contest. Genevieve Haverhill, seated beside her father in the observer section, looked at me once, and then never again, which was somehow worse than sustained hostility, because it meant she had already categorized me as something beneath sustained attention. I did not flinch. Flinching was a luxury for women who had not spent 3 years sitting across from creditors who wanted them to cry. Rhett entered the chamber and the room rearranged itself around him the way it always did, not with deference exactly, but with a gravitational awareness, every body in the space acknowledging the largest object in its orbit. He was brief. He did not frame me as a choice. He framed me as a biological fact, a scent lock confirmed by the same neurochemical processes that every Lycan in the room relied on to identify their own mates. To reject the recognition on the basis of species, he said, would be to reject the foundational biological authority that Lycan society was built on. It was the most political thing I had ever heard him say. It was also the most honest. The chamber fractured. I watched it happen in real time, alliances shifting like tectonic plates. Some faces settling into reluctant acceptance, while others hardened into the kind of opposition that does not announce itself, but calculates quietly. The Haverhills left before the session closed. 2 families formally withdrew their alliance before the doors shut behind them. The cost was real. I watched Rhett absorb it without flinching, and I understood that he had known the price before he walked into the room and had paid it the moment he decided, not today but 32 days ago in a candlelit corridor, that the bond was not something he was willing to trade. Weeks passed. The political architecture shifted slowly, painfully, in the way that all real change moves. I did not move into the estate. I kept my apartment. I kept working through my father's debts, with the methodical stubbornness that had kept me alive this long. But I crossed the border freely now. I had a seat at Rhett's table, a real one, and occasionally I offered the kind of blunt, unvarnished perspective that made his old advisors deeply uncomfortable and made Rhett's mouth do that almost smile I had been collecting since the first night at the diner. I was still fierce, still proud, still incapable of leaning without bracing for the thing I was leaning on to disappear. But I was learning. The final evening was quiet, the private wing, the lake turning silver through the tall windows. I stood at the glass with the last light on the water, and Rhett entered the room behind me, and I did not turn around because I did not need to. I knew his scent the way I knew my own name now. Constant, present, unquestioned. He stood behind me, close but not touching, waiting, the way he always waited, with patience that looked effortless and cost everything. I reached back without turning around and took his hand. One open hand. After a lifetime of white-knuckled grip, he laced his fingers through mine and said nothing. The bond settled between us like a second heartbeat, steady, warm, no longer pulling because there was nowhere left to pull toward. I had spent my whole life holding on so tightly that my hands ached. But standing there, with his fingers woven through mine and the lake turning silver in the last light, I finally understood something my body had known since the night of the gala. The bravest thing I would ever do was not breaking in. It was letting someone stay. And that is where we leave Briar and Rhett tonight. If this story made you hold your breath, made your chest tight, made you whisper finally when she reached for his hand, then you already know you belong here. Welcome to Eliana's Romance Library, to where the slow burns hit different and the cliffhangers never apologize. Now I need something from you. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you are listening from tonight. City, country, your couch at 2 a.m. with the lights off, I want to know. This community stretches across the globe, and every single time I read those comments, it reminds me that great stories do not care about time zones. So represent. Let me see where the romantics are tuning in from. And if you are the kind of listener who cannot wait for the next chapter, who needs the episode the moment it drops, before everyone else, then the membership is calling your name. Join the Eliana's Romance Library Members Circle, and you get early access to every new upload before it goes public, exclusive batch releases so you can binge entire arcs in one sitting, and members-only content that never hits the main feed. The link is right below this video. Tap it. Join the inner circle. You will not regret it. Subscribe if you have not already. Hit that notification bell so YouTube actually tells you when I post. Like this video, because the algorithm respects listeners with taste. And share it with that one person in your life who says they do not like romance, but stays up until 3 a.m. reading it anyway. You know exactly who I am talking about. Send them this link. I will see you in the next story. And trust me, you are not ready for what comes next.